Why don't we start with a prayer? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Master, lover of mankind, make the pure light of your divine knowledge shine in our hearts, and open the eyes of our mind to understand the message of your gospel. Implant in us the fear of your blessed commandments, so that having trampled down all carnal desires, we may change to a spiritual way of life, thinking and doing all things that are pleasing to you. For you are the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God. And to you we give glory together with your Father, who is without beginning, and your all-holy, good, and life-giving Spirit, now and forever, into the ages of ages. Amen. Well, welcome back, everyone. Happy New Year, and blessed Theophany. We left off last time talking about essentially paradise as the two bookends of the story, right? We begin in paradise and we end in paradise in Revelation, in the heavenly paradise. But there's a whole lot of the story in between, because we find ourselves actually in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end in a certain respect in the church. But there's a whole lot of that story in between that we're trying to fill in as we go along. And so we've started with Adam and paradise and the fall, and we're moving forward now. And what we begin to see almost immediately is that the results of Adam's choice and his sin are disastrous, and they begin to show up almost immediately. Right? Because as soon as we are done reading about the consequences of the fall, we begin to read about Adam and Eve and their children, Cain and Abel. And almost immediately, we see the result of pride, of envy coming into play, the will to power come into play. And we see that their sons have a serious issue, right? Cain, their son, kills their son Abel. We see this complete descent into sin beginning almost immediately, right? And God says to Cain, is it not true that if you do what is right, you will be fine? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. It desires to dominate you, but you must subdue it. Now, this reading here, sin is crouching at the door, is what you find in the Hebrew, and actually what you also find in the Latin Vulgate. The Septuagint paraphrases it a little bit. You don't quite get this same sense. But the Hebrew word here that they're using for sin is crouching at the door is actually a cognate or related word to an Akkadian word, which was a specific type of demon that crawled up out of a crack in the ground. Okay, and so it's a very visual and evocative idea of sin trying to dominate us, right? That when we, as God says here, do not do what is right, that we are conquered by sin, we are oppressed, and we are dominated by sin in this very real sense, right? And we find this sense actually continuing on even in the church. Evagrius Ponticus, one of the great monastic writers of the early church, in the first volume of the Philokalia, he says, all thoughts producing anger or desire in a way that is contrary to nature are caused by demons. It is impossible to overcome these passions unless we can rise above attachment to food and possessions, to self-esteem, and even to our very own body that the demons seek to attack us. It is essential to imitate people who are in danger at sea and throw possessions overboard because of the violence of the winds and the waves. In other words, the winds and the waves of demonic oppression are attacking us, and we need to emulate people at sea who begin throwing things overboard in order to survive the waves. We throw overboard our sin, our passions, our attachment to the things of this world, our attachment to our own pleasures, our attachment to various vices, right? This is how we avoid being conquered by this sin which is crouching at our door. Okay. And we begin to see immediately, right after describing the fact that Cain has killed Abel, and Cain is sent off, so to speak, right? He's sent into a faraway land. It begins to recount the line of Cain, Cain's children. This is in Genesis 4:17 through 23. Or actually, it continues on, I think, to 24. It says, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city, and the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begot Mehujael. Mehujael begot Methushael. Methushael begot Lamech. Then Lamech took 2 wives for himself. Notice, so we already have the first city builder, and now we have the first polygamist. All right, the line of Cain is already, we're seeing 2 things come into play. Technology of a certain sort, and we'll talk about what sort, and sin is already coming into the line of Cain. Lamech took 2 wives for himself. The name of one was Adah, and the name of the second was Zillah. So Adah bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He is the one who invented the psaltery and the harp, or music. As for Zillah, she also bore Tubal-Cain, a smith and a manufacturer of bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. So we see more of the technologies of a certain sort, right? These certain skills that are starting to come in this line. And then there's this line, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Well, if there's one thing we know about the literature of the Old Testament, is that generally, especially in these genealogies, they didn't generally call out women unless there was a very specific purpose, okay? There's no description given there. There are some commentators who say she was probably the first prostitute. That's what's going on there, is that it's sort of suggesting that. Not necessarily for sure, right? That's not exactly spelled out, but there's reason to suggest that that's probably what's going on. It says, Then Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, Hear my voice, you wives of Lamech, and listen carefully to my words, because I killed a man for wounding me, and a young man for hurting me. If Cain shall be avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. He's the first polygamist, he's a murderer, and he's a boaster, right? And we see all of these things starting to come in the line of Cain already. There's this descent into sin. And what's important to note is that this is really not that different than a lot of the historical memory in the mythologies of many other cultures and many other religions, right? Because what they remember is this idea of an ancient civilization before the calamity, before the fall. We see this in before the flood. In, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, we see this. These ideas of technology, certain technique, right, certain skills and knowledge being revealed by demonic powers in order to tempt people into greater sin, greater pride, greater will to power, and leading them astray. We see this Prometheus, the Sumerian Apkallu. All of the great rulers of Samaria were said to have a demonic power that revealed knowledge to them in their ruling of the civilization. You see it with echoes of Atlantis, right? This being submerged in the waters, civilization that was advanced in technology and so on, right? We see in St. Peter 2:4-5, For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into the chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. And he spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the 8th person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. So there's this idea, and you see it a little bit referenced as well in Jude and in 1 Peter, and you see it a lot in the Second Temple literature of 1 Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and elsewhere, that these were fallen angels that were coming down to the earth and the lower parts of earth, tempting people and trying to lead men further and further into sin.
Okay, Father, so here we go with mythology and reality. So what I've grown up being stories, you're presenting that there's enough evidence through the scholarly searches and so forth that this stuff is real, and this is really what happened.
In terms of the Bible, yes.
Bible and even mankind being influenced from antediluvian.
Which just means before the flood.
Yes, okay,
Yeah.
so God prior life, before the flood, they got to terror. So all these stories we hear now, which could be passed off as myth, have some root to it.
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, the one thing that's important to remember is that myth doesn't mean it's not true. Myth just means it's a story.
That's good to know.
And the problem is that in the post-Joseph Campbell world, we've taken myth to mean not true. Okay? The Bible's a myth. It doesn't mean it's not true in that sense, right? In the more historical sense of the word, and in fact, in its original Greek term, right? Now, what you find in a lot of these other faiths is you find echoes of the truth that have been distorted by people who have been influenced by those demons, right? And if anything, what you're seeing in the Bible is the corrective from God, right? You're seeing the corrective by the Hebrews saying, not quite, close, but not quite, right? But the fact that you see echoes of these same things in various cultures isn't an indication of just sort of, people projecting ideas, big patterns or whatever, just sort of projecting our own internal world on history. Rather, I think you can see it as echoes of, oh, there's some truth to the history back here, and the Bible's providing the corrective for how it really went down. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's how I would put
Thanks,
it. I've heard it put, Father Stephen DeYoung calls it demonic propaganda, right? That these stories, the Sumerian stories, the Greek mythology, whatever, it's all demonic propaganda, right? It's the demons trying to explain away the history in a light more favorable to them. Okay? Rather than just saying it's all completely bogus. Because, as we'll see, and as I'll mention in a little while, there are flood stories throughout the world. You can find them in the Lakota Sioux have a flood history in their mythology, their history, right? A great deal in Mesopotamian epics. We have some of those, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we'll talk about. Some of the ancient African religions, in some of the ancient Asian religions, even in the Philippines, in the sort of pre-Catholic world of the Philippines. You can find this in a lot of these ancient memories. And I would say, rather than following the Joseph Campbell or Carl Jung version, which is none of it's true and it's all just psychologized, right? I'd say the opposite. I'd say it is true. It's that those who weren't enlightened by God and His grace over time have succumbed to the demonic propaganda as to how it went down. And the Bible provides the corrective and the truth, right? Does that make sense? All right.
You really want to add, if you don't believe that demons are real and angelics are real, you've got to get to that point before any of the stuff starts making sense.
Right. And going back to that last quote from Vagres Ponticus that we talked about, the church's tradition leaves no room whatsoever for a demythologized world in which there is not demonic oppression, right? And if you don't believe me, come to a baptism, right? Listen to the prayers of exorcism that are read at the beginning of a baptism and tell me the church believes that evil is just some, the dark side of the force, right? It's something much more than that. Yeah.
You know, the other thing, Deacon Justin, is what is after this, I believe it's Peter that goes on to say who's gonna judge these guys, right, the angels, and that's an interesting thought too, you know.
And we'll talk about this as we go forward. We'll start getting into this a little bit more with Abraham very soon. We will be called to judge with God. Right? He will share that judgment with us. Right? But we'll talk more about that as we go on. Right? I'll mention more of that in a moment. So as mankind begins to multiply in the face of the earth, right? This is from Genesis 6. When humankind began to multiply, down there, on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humankind were beautiful. Thus they took wives for themselves from any they chose. So the Lord said, my spirit will not remain in humankind indefinitely, since they are mortal. They will remain for 120 more years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after this, when the sons of God would sleep with the daughters of humankind, who gave birth to their children. They were the mighty heroes of old, the famous men. So this is what follows. You know, the scripture sets up the line of Cain, and then it describes the descendants of Adam through his son Seth. And then it comes to this, and this is what immediately precedes the story of Noah. And so what are we dealing with here, right? There's really three ways that this has been understood in time. The first is that these sons of God that it's referring to specifically are angels. And then angels are coming down and actually having relations with humans, and they're giving birth to children. Okay? As St. Theodoret and St. John of Damascus say, that's impossible, right? Now, they didn't know DNA at the time, but they understood metaphysics enough to know that a bodiless angel is not going to be able to have a child with a human woman, right? But you still see that pop up in various, often more fringe faiths out there, that this is an actual angel having children with a human woman, okay? The second and much more common interpretation that you do find with St. Augustine and St. Theodoret and some of the other fathers is that the sons of God here is referring to the line of Seth, and that the daughters of men is referring to the line of Cain. That in other words, the righteous line of Seth began to intermingle with the line of Cain. They begin to have children. The line of Cain is starting to affect the line of Seth, and the people are starting to not be righteous any longer and are beginning to fall into the same sins as the line of Cain. Okay? So you do find that patristic line, and that's an acceptable, interpretation as far as the church is concerned. But if you also look, though, at the earlier Jewish literature from the time of Christ, and there's reason to believe that this is probably the best understanding of this passage, is that, Nephilim means giants. And in the Greek, in Septuagint, the word used is gigantes, right? Giants. But it's not referring to physically huge people, right? Like there's some other race that is just massively large. Notice, for example, Goliath, who we'll talk about later, was another one of these giants he's described. But if you actually read the Septuagint and the older manuscripts, he's only described as being about 6'5", 6'6". Okay, still pretty big for the ancient world, but that's a power forward shooting guard in the NBA. It's not unnatural. It's big, but it's not unnatural, right? It seems to be more that this is being used in the same way that we use the word strongman, right? When we refer to Kim Jong-un as a strongman, nobody sees the doughboy there and says he's like, world's strongest man. What they mean is that he's a tyrant, right? It seems to be more being used in that sense. So what's it referring to when it talks about sons of God and daughters of men? There is evidence, both archaeologically, in various texts of practices of various peoples around Israel, as well as in some of the discussion from the Second Temple Jewish literature, that what these Nephilim were the products of particular pagan rituals in which most often a king, who was considered to be divine, would, at a particular time and in a particular way, in a ritualized way, have relations with some sort of temple prostitute who was thought to be possessed by the spirit of a god or goddess in that moment. And in the course of this, she would conceive and give birth to a child that was considered to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. These were the results of demonized unions, demonized rituals, and demonized practices. And we hear about this because there are, even though this race of Nephilim will be wiped out in the flood, as we'll talk about, in fact, we'll hear about them come back, because we'll hear more about them when we get to Goliath, right? And when we get to people like Og, the king of Bashan, who gets mentioned in Genesis and then again in the Psalms a number of times, right? And he's described, in fact, as having this big iron bed that was 13.5 feet long, okay? And they've actually found, this is an overview, and unfortunately blown up like that, it doesn't look very good. It's the ruins of a major ziggurat in Babylon. And they've actually found there a throne room that had not only a throne, but also an incredibly large bed. And it was known as the bed throne room in the ziggurat for Sumerian pagan practices, right? Why is Og's bed relevant? It's because of these practices. And this is not unique even to the ancient Near East. Okay? To this day, in Japanese public worship, the emperor is considered to be a godlike figure. How does he spend the first night after he's enthroned? With the temple virgins from the Shinto temple. Okay. Now, today they say that no hanky-panky goes on. It's only sort of ritual, or whatever. It's sanitized. But that certainly wasn't the practice in the past. And we see this practice in a lot of other situations where you have, people associated with the temple, both men and women in different contexts, different cultures, possessed by demons in the course of their ritualized practices, and the offspring that are born of them are considered to be this half god, half man. Which, going back to what I said before, is why in a lot of ancient faiths and mythologies, you find precisely these references to these half god, half men people. And you can find in those cultures the practices of some form of temple prostitutes or something of that nature. With the Sumerians, it was Gilgamesh, right? With the Greeks, it was Achilles and many others. The Romans had Hercules. The Celtics had the Fomorians. Hindus have Arjuna and many others. In Polynesian mythology, it was Maui. In Bantu religion, it was this person whose name I can't pronounce. But in many different cultures throughout the world, you find this notion of demigods. And you can usually find in those practices some sort of pagan ritual that approximates what we're talking about here. This is also why you see it resurface down the road in what are called the Rephaim or the Rephaites, like Og, with even the Palestinians, with Goliath, and some of these others. You see this practice start coming back. And as we'll get to and we'll talk to down the road, it's why when Joshua and the Israelites go into the promised land, there are certain tribes that they're allowed to make peace with, and there are certain tribes they're not allowed to make peace with. And the tribes that they're not allowed to make peace with are the giant clans, the ones who are engaged in this demonizing worship in which people are being taken over by demons and their offspring are being demonized from the very outset of their lives. Right? Does this make a little bit of sense? It's a little bit of a different way of understanding. But fast forward, you know, in the gospel, it refers a lot to the unclean spirits. Okay? Right? The unclean spirits that possess various people. Unclean under the law. In the Jewish world, unclean has a very specific meaning in certain contexts. It means mixed. Things that were mixed were unclean, right? You wouldn't boil beef in milk, right? You don't wear clothes of two different types of material in the old law. And various other things. They didn't like things that were mixed. That was considered to be unclean. If you read the literature of the Jewish writings, the rabbis, just prior to the time of Christ, the reason these spirits are called unclean in the Jewish faith at that time is they were considered mixed spirits. They were the souls of Nephilim, who had died, who had become so demonized in their life that they essentially took on the qualities of the demons themselves. Right? And we find references to that even in St. John Chrysostom. That he says, in the same way that we believe in theosis, that by doing the work of God, by participating in God, we become more and more and more like him, transformed into him, to the point where St. Paul can say, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Chrysostom also says the same is true for the people who do demonic works, that we become more and more and more like them, right? The demonic works of envy, the demonic works of pride, the demonic works of lust, right? All of these things, the demonic works of lack of charity and love for your brother and sister, right? It doesn't mean just pagan practices. He means any work of sin starts to form our soul in the image of the very people whose works we are participating in, meaning the demons. And so in the ancient Jewish faith, it was understood that some of these Nephilim had become so demonized that in fact they became like the demons themselves and continued to operate on the earth in a sense. Okay. So this is how bad things have gotten on the earth. We're not given to fully understand what the length of time is that we're talking about, right? The one thing about genealogies in the scriptures is that it's not meant to be exclusive. In other words, it's you can have a grandfather followed by like a grandson, and the fact that the father isn't necessarily included doesn't matter so much. So people who try and use the genealogy specifically to work out exactly a timeline, that's difficult, that's problematic to do. But nevertheless, that's what's going on here, right? And it's in that context that we get to Noah. Now Noah, his name actually means rest, right? Or peace in Hebrew. And as it describes, he will give us rest from our work, right? And in that sense, he's meant to be a type of Christ. Christ who says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." So in that sense, Noah is meant to be an image of Christ. Now, it's not clear exactly where all of this takes place. We're not given exact coordinates. Every archaeologist who says, "I found it, I found the mountain, I found the place," they're quickly debunked. But there is definitely a sense in the way that the scriptures is describing this to bring to mind the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. Okay? There are accounts in many of the ancient texts from that region about major floods that wipe out civilizations. And we find that in the Sumerian Kings list, the story of Atrahasis, the Sumerian flood story that we find in the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? There's this very strong history of discussing the flood in the Mesopotamian literature, even outside the Bible at that time. It is funny, by the way, and I've heard people mention this, it's amazing how archaeologists will believe it if it's in the Sumerian Kings list. They'll believe it if it's in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But if it's in the Bible, it's subject to doubt, right? The Bible is suspect in terms of its historicity, but, the Sumerian Kings list, we can rely on that for the most part, right?
Is the flood that's being talked about in all these, is it the same flood?
Sure sounds like it, right? If you've ever, it's been years since I've read the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it sure sounds a lot, right? In these stories, in these histories, it's basically the gods are getting annoyed with humans, right? In Gilgamesh, it's that the people are too noisy. The gods can't do what they want to do without being bugged and annoyed by the humans who are so loud and noisy and making such a ruckus down there. So we're just going to wipe them out, right? And essentially, few people are able to be saved, right, through various machinations. But yeah, there's something there about, right, the humans are at odds with the gods, and the gods decide they're going to wipe them out, and they do it by means of a flood, right? So what are we dealing with then in the flood? Well, what happens is God has found that humanity has fallen so headlong into sin and corruption to the point where they are now being demonized. They are in direct communication and being oppressed by these demons. They're being led into all sorts of sin, and it's time to essentially start afresh, right? And I want to remind you all of how the Hebrew mind conceived of the cosmos, right? Because you have the waters above the firmament with the various windows into the heavens, into the sky, right? Through which rain could come down. Those windows would open and rain could come down. You had the earth and the foundations of the earth and the heavens. And then there was the waters that were under the earth, right? And there were floodgates essentially beneath that were trapping them. And what we see in the story of Noah is really the flood in particular is a decreation event, right? Because look, in Genesis 1, God creates the heavens and the earth, and the Spirit hovers over the great deep, right? And he sets the firmament in the sky to hold back the waters, right? And the earth with the waters under the earth. In Genesis 7, we read that the fountains of the great deep are broken open. The windows of heaven are opened, and the earth is flooded with water. And this image of water is chaos, right? We talked about back when we were talking about creation, this notion of bringing order to chaos. The water was a chaotic force, right, that God brought order to in the creation event. Here, the fountains of the great deep are being broken open, the windows are being opened up, and the earth is being flooded with chaos again. Order is being essentially wiped away, right? The order is being taken away, and chaos is coming back in. It's essentially a decreation event, right? And
it just dawned on me, the interesting thing about that is that, again, the water,
Right.
we all need water to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, water can also kill.
That's right.
That's
right. It's one of the great images of baptism, right? And what we've heard so much in the hymns of theophany over the last week is that water in baptism represents both death and life, right? We go into the water as a symbol of our death, and we come out of the water as a symbol of new life. And the water gets used then by Christ as an image of the living water, right? The Holy Spirit bubbling up, the great fountain bubbling up from within our heart. It has both of those meanings. You're exactly right. It's both necessary for life and yet this incredible destructive force.
I was thinking of Christ talking at the well with Bottini and talking to her about, I will create in you a spring of water that will well up, like thinking about the fountains of the deep. Like
Exactly.
that's really kind of cool.
Yeah. And we see that even in paradise, right? He separates the water. You know, the water is the chaos. He separates it. And then what does he put right smack in paradise but the four rivers that are this living water bringing life to the entire universe, right? So yeah, those images are there in both places. And when we hear living water, because we hear it in Ezekiel as well, and when we hear it in Ezekiel, it's really getting at his vision of the rivers that come from the new Jerusalem. And so when Christ is saying, I will give you living water bubbling up from within you, what he's saying is, I will create paradise in you, in your heart. I will make paradise within your heart. Right? And we participate in paradise in that way. It's actually a much more profound statement sometimes than we, I think, give it full credit for. It's why it has such a prominent story, such a prominent place right after Pascha. And we pick up that imagery in the Sunday of the Samaritan woman with St. Photini, but then all through the mid-Pentecost feast, and even carrying over into Pentecost itself. We carry it through for weeks. And the thing that I think we have to remember when we think about the flood is, if you go in the cry room in our church, what's there? It's Noah's Ark, right? And we have, all these little pictures, and we get our kids little storybooks. And I was just looking in our house from when the kids were little. We have a little model of Noah's Ark that we used to have on the shelf, and it's all so cute because it's got the animals. And, we sing, the Lord told Noah to build it, right? We got these little nursery songs and all these other things. There is nothing nice and cute and sweet about the flood. Right? It is not a nice, sweet, cute little story. The earth is covered with rotting flesh, right? I mean, this is a big deal, right? There's some 16th century paintings, when they come out of the ark, it's not looking good on the earth, right? They're literally starting over from some pretty serious devastation and destruction, right? And before I talk about that starting over, I do want to answer a quick question. Why 2 unclean animals and 7 clean? Do you ever notice? We always talk about the animals came 2 by 2, but it's actually 2 by 2 if they're unclean, 7 animals if they were clean. To sacrifice one. For the clean animals, you want more clean animals than you want unclean, and you have an odd number so that when you get off of the ship, you can offer one as sacrifice. You have the 3 pairs of the clean and 1 to sacrifice. Right? St. Theodore of Cyrus talks about this. If you ever want, it's a fascinating 2-volume book. Theodore of Cyrus, the questions on the Octateuch. So it's Genesis through Ruth and his commentary on various questions. It's not a verse-by-verse commentary. It's it's more or less chronological, but just asking questions and then trying to answer them the best he can.
This kind of goes back to Cain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because
he wouldn't offer
that
sacrifice.
caused all his trouble.
That's right.
The unclean.
Yeah. So, right. And so God is already instructing Noah on how to offer sacrifice, on how to worship, and begin again on the right foot, essentially, right? Because isn't that the first thing Noah does, is he gets off of the ship and he begins to offer sacrifice, right? But then what we see is right after, in the aftermath, a recreation event, right? There's a recreation with Noah. The sinful first race, so to speak, has been wiped out. The earth has been cleansed. Think about it, at that point, they were largely making things out of untreated wood and out of clay baked in the sun. You submerge all that in water, those structures are gone, right? The clay is dissolved, the wood's going to be soggy and wet and falling apart. But what we see with Noah is that he's starting over, but it's now in a fallen world, right? Whereas the first creation event in paradise and God's commands to Adam and Eve at that time were in a not yet fallen world. They were in paradise. With Noah, he's giving them instruction in a fallen world. And so, in chapter 9, and by the way, and the covenant that he's going to form with Noah is going to extend through the entire cosmos. The entire world is going to be affected, all of creation, not just men and women. Right? So what is this covenant? Well, in chapter 9 of Genesis, it says, "Thus God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, 'Increase and multiply, fill the earth.'" Where have we heard that before? Right? The same command given to Adam and Eve. "Have dominion over it." Same thing. "For the dread and fear of you shall be upon all the wild animals of the earth, all the birds of heaven, all that move upon the earth, and all the fish of the sea. I have put them under your authority." Right? "Everything that lives shall be food for you." So he has dominion over the earth, but it's now in a context of fear and dread. Right? It's fallen man who has dominion over the earth. And there's no longer this pristine kind of relationship, so to speak, right? It's fear and dread. God then tells them what to eat, right? But no longer is it this tree and not that tree. It's now eat of any living thing. Eat of every living thing, right? Both the moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as I did the green herbs. Right? So we're beginning to eat meat. And he says, "I made man in God's image." Right? But what's the reason for that? Is now he's saying there are consequences for murder. Right? He says, "I will require the life of man at the hand of his fellow man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood should be shed, because I made man in God's image. So then increase and multiply and fill the earth and have dominion over it." So it's, essentially this recreation covenant as he made with Adam and Eve, but the primary difference is now it's already a fallen world. Does this make sense? Now, as the sign of this, he puts the rainbow in the sky. And the rainbow is such a nice, pretty, happy thing. I mean, look, I smile every time I see a rainbow. I point it out to whoever's around me and everything else. It is not there for a nice little thing. Because the word bow that's being used there is like a bow and arrow or a crossbow. It's a weapon. Okay. And it's the curved part, right, in the sky, which would mean the flat part is on the earth. Well, we know from ancient Near East archaeological digs and impressions, for example, this is King Ashurnasirpal II offering peace to his conquered enemies. And when his conquered enemies came to pay tribute, he greets them holding his bow, his weapon of war, with the string facing his enemies as a sign of peace. The string is the business end of the bow. He offers the string to them as a way of saying, "I'm making peace and no longer making war against you." And it's that imagery that's at play when God places the rainbow, the bow of the skies, in the sky, with the string on the earth And he says, right, because he says, no longer will I do this. Where is the verse now?
13.
I'm sorry?
Verse 13.
13, thank you. He says, I'm setting my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth, the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. My rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will certainly remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh on the earth. Now, first of all, God doesn't need to be reminded, right? It's more a sign for us. And he's using again this imagery that they understood from their culture that we kind of miss because we don't have that same culture. But he's saying, I'm laying down this weapon of rain, right? This weapon of flooding. And we'll no longer use it to wipe out all flesh. And in doing so, that covenant extends to the entire cosmos, right? Because he's not going to do this decreation and recreation in that sense anymore, right? The next stage of it all essentially is in Christ, the new creation, the new heaven and the new earth, through the coming of Christ and coming of peace. Any questions on this before I move to a slightly different topic? Yeah.
Definition of cosmos, it seems to be planet Earth as opposed to everything, or
Not if you understand Hebrew cosmology. It's all of it.
we're talking all the stars, all the
Yeah,
creation,
because the stars are within
or
the
within
firmament.
the cosmos. Yeah.
Mhm.
That was my question.
But, yeah.
Okay, this goes back much farther than this. It's always bugged me. When they told us when we go out and multiply, who are they multiplying with?
You know,
I mean,
so,
because we know what happens when you inbreed.
well, yeah,
I've always
and
wondered about that.
you know, maybe DNA wasn't quite so corrupted yet. Let me find Saint Theodoret. Here it is. Question 43. Whom did Cain marry? He says his sister, of course. At the time, this was not an offense, no law forbidding it, especially since there was no other way to provide for the increase of the race. God willed that all the nations of humanity be brought into being from one man and one woman. First, so that springing from one couple, they would perceive that they all possessed the same basic nature. Second, so that growing from one root, they would be joined in harmony. If even after the God of the universe arranged things like this, they dare to commit countless murders, what would they stop at if they thought themselves descended from different parents? Therefore, he formed one man from the earth, created one woman from him, and filled the whole world with their offspring. To achieve this goal, he allowed intercourse of brother and sister in the beginning, but when the race had increased, he made this kind of marriage unlawful. Hence, in the ark, along with Noah and his sons, he saved also the wives of his sons, so that the boys could be married to their cousins. Does that make a little sense?
Yeah, because I was thinking about the Egyptians too, because that's what they did, and then they started looking strange.
Right. At some point, God steps in and says, no more.
Yeah.
Right? Not, yeah.
Is, maybe it really goes to Adam and Eve, even there where the ribs removed, and is that DNA, or if you wanted to think of it scientifically?
I mean, it could be, yeah. I mean, it's interesting, you know, in Hebrew, the word for bone, and I'm blanking on the word right now, but the word for bone and the word for substance are basically the same word. And so, ish means like man, yeah. Isha,
So
meaning
more like skeletal of the foundation, or
yeah, but I mean, like,
substance,
bone meaning substance, so you could sort of understand it as him saying, you know, when he says, this is bone of my bone, I mean, what he's recognizing is we're the same substance, right? We're the same basic thing. And I love the way that Saint Theodoret puts it, that he arranged for us all to be descended from the same man and woman, so that we would recognize we're all brothers and sisters. And he says if we all hate each other that much, right, we're all killing each other, and we're hating each other and engaging in racism and all these other things, right, and we're descended from the same man and woman, just think how bad it would be if we weren't. So as we look forward, we learn about Noah's children. And there's this incident that we read about that is much debated among scholars and so on. But it basically, it involves a little too much wine and a little too much nakedness. Noah plants a vineyard, he begins drinking wine, he gets drunk, and it says that Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walking backwards, they covered their father's nakedness. Since their faces were turned away, they did not see his nakedness. Thus, when Noah became sober and knew what his younger son had done to him, he said, and he goes on to curse Canaan, the son of Ham. Okay. It's not entirely clear from the text what exactly this episode is talking about. There are some who suggest, to uncover someone's nakedness is sort of a euphemism, meaning some sort of relations. And so there's some suggestion here that what might be going on is that Ham is committing incest with his mother, that his father, being drunk, fell asleep in the act, and Ham finished as a way of usurping his father's authority. In the ancient world, that was one of the ways, right? When David's son Absalom wants to take over David's throne, what does he do? He immediately takes David's wives as his own, right? It was kind of a way of usurping your father or another person. So there are some that suggest, and that's why when Noah wakes up, who is he cursing? It's not Ham, but Ham's son. There's some suggestion that Canaan is that offspring of the incestuous relationship. And you actually find in some of the Canaanite practices down the road, ritualized incest. And so there's some suggestion that maybe that's what's going on there, but it's not, you can take that theory or leave it, right? It's not entirely clear, but that is one plausible explanation for what's going on. Shem and Japheth see this going on and try to stop it, or at least cover it up, right? They're involved in trying to protect all of this. Ham receives his name, it means to be humbled, and his descendants are the Canaanites and the Egyptians, who are to become the enemies of the Israelites, of the Hebrews, right? Japheth to be increased, his descendants are the Anatolians and the Aegeans, kind of up north, right? Japheth to be increased because the area of land he gets is so big, right? And Shem means literally just name, okay? One of the euphemisms for saying God's name is to simply say Hashem, the name, right? Shem means name, which is where we get this word Semite. And his descendants will be, among others, the Israelites.
That's where Semites come from.
Right. Yeah. Which is always kind of funny when I hear people refer to like Arab Palestinians as being anti-Semitic. They're quite literally themselves Semitic. Arabic is a Semitic language. It's kind of a silly thing to say. Anyway, so yeah, that's where we're getting that term. Right? And so what we already see in Noah's offspring is a reference to. Remember, we said before that the story we're following is the people of God. The original plan, at least, the people of God living in the place of God, in the presence of God. Right? We're beginning to see that taking shape already through the fact that God's people will be the descendants of Shem. He says he will dwell, his dwelling shall be in their tents. maybe a prophecy of the tent of meeting, right? The place isn't exactly yet identified, although it does say that they will conquer the descendants of Canaan. And what is the land that the promised land will later be identified in? Canaan, right? Their very place. But that's not exactly yet clear in the prophecy that God is making. But it's certainly clear that God's people will be the descendants of Shem, and he will dwell in their tents. Which is where we'll pick up next time when we start talking about Abraham. For which I would suggest reading Genesis 12 through 15 and Romans 4. Any other questions you were?
What was the coin?
It was just an old image from an old Catholic engraving of Shem.
Okay, is it Israeli money or?
No, it's an imprint from a probably Italian book, I think, in the Renaissance times.
Go back to the reading assignment, please.
Thank you.
Any questions on what we're talking about? We're talking ancient history tonight still, so.
With the covering of Noah by the two sons,
Right.
is that, I mean, that shows reverence. And,
Right, it shows the respect and the reverence for him.
It is really, my thought on it is, Noah's the only one, the reason anyone was saved.
Right. You would think that they would
Yeah,
respect him,
the
right?
sons were just tagging along.
Right, that's
Yeah.
right. All right, any other questions? Yeah, Bob?
I'm just a little bit confused here. God destroyed the earth the first time because of mankind's sin. That's right. And then Noah gets the job of repopulating the earth, but immediately gets
Pretty quick.
involved in debauchery and drunkenness and just plain old sinfulness.
It's kind of how we go, right?
Yeah.
How long do you last after confession?
How did he, with his pedigree, how did he get picked?
What's that? Oh,
With his pedigree, how did he get chosen?
This guy gets-
could be worse. Could have been Lamech.
It maybe tells us what the population was like.
Yeah, I mean, it's, right, I mean, it's probably a good indication. If Noah and his family were the most righteous people in the entire earth,
Yeah.
gives you a sense for maybe why God did wipe it out, right? Yeah.
It's also reminiscent of Abraham's, Lot and his daughters. After
Lot and his daughters,
they're the
yeah.
only ones left from a similar wipeout.
That's
They have
very
a
similar, I
fall.
thought,
Yeah, exactly. And, and there was a lack of faith, right? I mean, and here there's there's maybe a certain sense of that, right? He wants to keep the repopulation going because he has no faith that God can do it the way that he had ordained. Maybe that's a part of it, yeah.
Something that's always been amazing to me, speaking of, debauchery or whatever, is Christ's lineage, because David's in there, Rahab, and some other characters. It's funny, who would make God be some story and have him
Right.
hooked up with sinners, It's just, that's the amazing part of the Bible to me,
Yeah.
how they don't protect anyone.
Yeah. And to all of that point, actually, maybe the best way to close out, I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity in the past to attend the services for the great Canon of St. Andrew of Crete during Lent. It's done in portions in some churches in the first 4 days of Lent, and then again on the 5th Thursday it's done in its entirety. It has some of the most profound meditations on Scripture, especially the Old Testament, and its applicability to us that you will find. And here, St. Andrew has some very stern things for us to say about ourselves in light of this story. He says, "To whom shall I liken thee, O soul of many sins? Alas, to Cain and to Lamech. For thou hast stoned thy body to death with thine evil deeds, and killed thy mind with thy disordered longing. Call to mind, my soul, all who lived before the law. Thou hast not been like Seth, or followed Enos or Enoch, who was translated to heaven, or Noah, but thou art found destitute, without a share in the life of the righteous. Thou alone, my soul, hast opened the windows of the wrath of thy God, and thou hast flooded as the earth all thy flesh and deeds and life. Thou hast remained outside the ark of salvation. I have slain a man to my grief and wounding, said Lamech, and a young man to my hurt, and he cried aloud, lamenting. Dost thou not tremble then, my soul, for thou hast defiled thy flesh and polluted thy mind? How I have emulated Lamech, the murderer of old, slaying my soul as if it were a man, and my mind as if it were a young man. With sensual longings I have killed my body as Cain the murderer killed his brother. I am wounded and smitten. See the enemy's arrows which have pierced my soul and body. See the wounds, the open sores, and the injuries. I cry to thee, God. See the blows inflicted by my freely chosen passions. And the refrain that we say throughout it is simply, have mercy on me, O God. Have mercy